I made a few trades that seemed reasonable at the time, but now I see that one of them was not very fair. My first trade was exchanging an artist dummy for Amreen's book called The Great Controversy From Conflict to Peace by Ellen G. White. The book sounded interesting at first because I quickly read the back cover and thought it might be worth trying. However, I brought it home and read more of it and realized it was not the kind of book I enjoy, so I ended up donating it to a local thrift store. I see this trade as unfair for a personal reason. I sometimes use the artist dummy as a visual tool to help me draw and understand the human form, so it actually had real value and use to me. Trading it for a book that I did not connect with and then gave away felt like a bad exchange. In simple terms, fairness to me was treating people with respect and also noticing their different situations. It is not about everyone getting the same thing, but about everyone having a fair chance to get what they need or to succeed. Fairness, in my view, is a mix of empathy and accountability. When I look back on this trade through the idea of fairness, I notice something important. I did not take enough time to make sure the trade would work out well for me. I didn't think about whether I would truly read or enjoy the book, or whether I might miss the artist dummy later on. Because my idea of fairness includes taking responsibility, my claim that the trade was unfair becomes a bit weaker. If fairness is about giving both sides a real chance, then I also had a role in checking whether the trade made sense to me. As a general principle, fairness sits between empathy and accountability. Empathy means thinking about how the other person feels about the trade and what they might gain from it. Accountability means accepting the results of my choices and asking whether they really support my own needs and goals. Before, I thought the trade was unfair mainly because I didn't like the outcome. Now I also see that fairness involves planning ahead, asking questions, and clearly understanding what I'm agreeing to. Overall, this experience taught me something useful about fairness in decision making. It reminded me that it is important to value my own needs while also respecting the needs of others. It also showed me that I share the responsibility for the outcome of a trade, not just the other person. By keeping both empathy and accountability in mind in the future, I can make fairer trades and develop a clearer sense of what fair really means in everyday.
So, Erving Goffman's dramaturgical theory is super relevant to any interaction that involves negotiation because negotiation necessarily involves performance. During the Agora exchange, I found that I was making an effort to present my trades as appealing if I approached someone with an item I wanted, regardless of my personal feelings about the item. For example, I brought a Californian transit card to attempt to trade with other people, kind of like a compass card for the Bay Area, which I have no attachment to and is functionally useless to people living in Vancouver. But I recall having at least 2 interactions with other students where I attempted to pitch it to them as highly valuable if they were to visit California on vacation. During these interactions, I was fully aware that the scenario wasn't particularly likely, and that even if it were, the usefulness of a transit card is highly dependent on a lot of factors, like not everyone is going to be using public transit if they're on vacation somewhere. But in my mind, it was advantageous to use the scenario as a bargaining chip for negotiation purposes. My affect in general also changed. I made an effort to be more polite and warm and friendly to make myself appealing to my trade partners. This is Goffman's front stage. My social performance was highly intentionally constructed so that I could achieve a certain end. In contrast, I found that my social performance through the interactions I had with the people within my group was less thoroughly constructed, because I wasn't as motivated to complete trades with my group mates as I was with the rest of the class, and because I was already familiar with them, I was less concerned about how I read. When discussing the trades with my group mates, I felt no pressure to frame my items a certain way, as I had when I was trading with other people in the class. This is not to say that I was behaving in a way which involved no performance, because I'm of the opinion that all social interactions involve a degree of performance, as Goffman seems to be too. Still, my interactions with my group mates were the backstage to the front stage I was on when interacting with the rest of the class because of the lack of pressure that came with them.
While participating in the Agora trades, it became extremely clear how unequal the whole process was. Even though everyone was participating in the same system and we were given the same instructions, we didn't all start with the same level of bargaining power. Some people started with items that were automatically seen as high value, while others brought items that nobody really wanted, which right away shaped the entire process. People who started with high value items had way more control in the trading process. They could negotiate confidently, compare multiple offers, and wait for the best deal, because they knew that they had what everyone wanted. They basically had the power to choose their own outcomes. Meanwhile, the people who started out with the lower value items didn't have that luxury. They had fewer options, less bargaining power, and had to take whatever trade they could get, even if the trade didn't benefit them. It wasn't about effort or strategy, it was about what they happened to begin with. This dynamic strongly reflects the operation of social cues in real society. Individuals born into families with greater wealth or resources have access to better opportunities, more extensive networks, and greater stability. This gives them an unequal advantage. just like having a high-value item did in our trades. On the other hand, people who come from lower class backgrounds often have to work much harder just to reach the same place, and even then, they will still face barriers that others never have to think about. Our trading activity effectively served as a small-scale representation of this reality. One starting point largely determines the range of possibilities available and the likelihood of their upward movement. Because of this, we do not believe that human society is essentially equal. Even when the rules appear to be applied uniformly, the unequal distribution of initial resources creates fundamentally different life chances. Some individuals begin with built-in advantages that make upward mobility for them far more attainable, while others struggle with disadvantages that they did not choose. The Agora trades made this inequality highly visible and demonstrated how profoundly it shapes people's outcomes both within the activity and in society.
When I think back on our class exchange where we traded small household items that weren't of major importance, it seemed like a clear example of free exchange at first. Everyone brought something that they didn't mind giving up, and everyone was free to choose what they wanted in return. No one was forced to trade into a trade, and the atmosphere was friendly and voluntary. But when we look a little closer, the exchange wasn't completely free in a deeper sense. Some people brought items that were more appealing or useful, while others brought things that were harder to trade. That meant certain students had more bargaining power than others, even though the activity was meant to be equal. So while the exchange felt free on the surface, the differences in what we brought created subtle inequalities that shaped the choices people could make realistically.
Bourdieu's work Distinction examines how individuals attribute and derive value from cultural objects, and how these objects acquire meaning and exist relationally to one another. He argues that individuals internalize their tastes and preferences based on their upbringing, social, and economic circumstances. These internalized dispositions then shape the value that we assign to different cultural objects. During Agora, although we had the freedom, within reason, to bring whatever objects we wished to trade, and were all equally free to participate in the activity, I would argue that we didn't experience a truly free exchange because each person entered with different amounts of cultural capital, which shaped the trading process and gave some individuals distinct social advantages. According to Bourdieu, theory on social capital shows that individuals increasingly establish status distinctions through the consumption of goods and as lifestyle choices. Capital operates as a form of cultural currency. Individuals enter exchanges, whether purely verbal social exchanges or the exchange of physical items, as in the case of Agora, with unequal amounts of capital, which then shapes these exchanges and makes them unequal. During Agora, what Bourdieu calls objectified cultural capital was at play, as we traded physical objects that were embedded with cultural meaning and symbolic value. For different people, these objects were embedded with different amounts of meaning. If the items were personal to them, they were embedded with more meaning for that specific person, but might not be embedded with meaning for the rest of the group. Exchanges at Agora were also shaped by embodied cultural capital, which is the ways of presenting oneself that can leverage social advantages. Additionally, because we posted our items on a shared document before the trade, students had time to evaluate their items, compare them, and mentally situate them within this hierarchy. Students enter the exchange already aware of the relative worth of their own objects compared to other objects, and aware of their likely position in the trading process. Some students' items were perceived as more desirable, which then gave these students a greater choice of items available to them and gave them more bargaining power in the process. In this way, both embodied and objectified cultural capital were at play during the Agora activity. Although the rules of the Agora activity were loose and participation was voluntary, giving students a large degree of freedom, I argue that the activity did not represent a genuine freedom of exchange, as differences in cultural capital impacted the trade hierarchy.
In thinking about relationships between freedom and equality, my view is that the two are deeply connected to the point where they feel almost interchangeable. In this experiment and in society more broadly, freedom is not just an ability to make choices, but it is an ability to make choices as an equal. If people are treated unequally, their freedom becomes symbolic rather than real. In our exchange, feeling free meant feeling like your item, your presence, and your decisions carried the same weight as everyone else's. When someone is seen or treated as lesser, whether because of their value of their items or the status they hold, their freedom quietly shrinks. So for me, true freedom requires equality. To be free is to stand in a space where your choices are respected, where your voice matters as much as others, and where you are not placed at a disadvantage before the exchange even begins. In that sense, the concept doesn't just relate, they reinforce each other to the point where one cannot be fully experienced without the other. As for whether the equality leads to freedom, I would argue that equality is the foundation that makes real freedom possible. Equality creates the conditions where people have the capacity to choose, not just permission to choose. In our exchange, imagine if everyone had brought items or similar useful or similar perceived value, then no one would feel pressured to accept the only deal available to them. People would be freer to negotiate, freer to walk away, and freer to decide based on what they genuinely wanted rather than what they were stuck with. On a larger scale, societies with greater equality give people more freedom because their decisions are not just shaped by desperation, lack of resources, or structural disadvantages. Equality widens the range of choices a person can make, and the more meaningful choices someone has, the more freedom they actually experience. In that way, equality is not just connected to freedom, but it actively expands it. In the end, the exchange showed that freedom and equality are deeply connected. The activity reminded us that even simple trades are shaped by what we bring into them. To truly have free exchange, we also need conditions that make the exchange fair. Only when people begin on relatively equal footing can their choices really be considered their own.